Thanks, Sam. So with the legacy of the Occult Detective, I'm looking from the Victorian spiritualists, even a little earlier with Gothic literature, to Monster of the Week TV shows, and I break it down through a couple different lenses. One is looking at the historical and social and political aspects of the genre, and the other is looking at really our relationship to the supernatural and the unknown. So that's like the pagan bruja and me looking at the spiritual side of how we try to engage with the world around us. And as with all things, you know, all these stories have really wonderful things about them and some really terrible things about them as well. So I will walk you through all of that fun. So to kind of establish the origins of the occult detective as an archetype and a genre, I want to kind of step back into the 18th century Gothic for a second. And I know I'm speaking to an audience who is well versed in the Gothic. But if we think of, so I'll just do a quick recap, but if we think of 18th century Gothic with Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto and this new interest in, you know, secret, scandalous romantic pasts, supernatural or unexplainable events, this idea of life being more than logic and reason and really pushing back against Enlightenment values, we have the Gothic coming to the fore to question those things and really honestly revel in the barbarous aspects of human nature, you know, everything that's transgressive and tawdry and taboo. It's also, as we know, a genre that explores the social, psychological, sexual and religious norms. And I tend to think of the Gothic as a transgressive genre that really questions and pushes against those norms. But of course, it's also can easily reinforce those norms as well. And we run into issues with the sublime. So the romantic sublime, the idea of nature or the universe being so much bigger than us, and it's absolutely beautiful and awe-inspiring, but fairly terrifying. I also like to give a quick refresher on Radcliffe's concepts of terror and horror. So Anne Radcliffe, the woman who made Gothic romances respectable, you know, she'd tell all these lurid tales of people doing bad things, and there would be the hint of the supernatural that gets conveniently explained away by rational events in the end. She really defines Gothic as falling into two categories. We have terror, which is this really weird sense of dread. I call it, you know, when we let our imagination get away with us, we're trying to anticipate this unknown or unseen thing, and the not knowing is what's terrifying. We see that a lot in occult detective fiction. So much of it is trying to make the unknown known, the invisible visible, and bringing those things that hide in the shadows into the light so that we feel like we have a little more control over things that scare us. And then occasionally we do get out and out horror, which is, you know, when you actually see the scary monster or the evil atrocity committed. And sometimes the horror, we have writers now who are doing interesting work where the horror is actually not the monster, but racism, homophobia, ableism, all of that. So some authors today are redefining horror in really epic ways. So if we move from Gothic literature, so late 18th century, it becomes incredibly popular. And as we move into the Victorian era, that interest in Gothic literature continues to grow into a general interest in the paranormal. So this idea that we can contact the spirit realm, that it is closer to us than we think, that there's more to the world than what meets the eye. So this is really taking off on the idea that we want to be more than concrete, rational Enlightenment values. And what I love about this so much is a lot of this early explorations in spiritualism really focused on quote unquote scientific studies. So it was used, we would call it pseudoscience now, but a lot of stuff like electrobiology, spirit photography, astrology, it was considered the new science. So many people really trying to understand the unseen world or the spirit world through concrete lenses. So it's a really interesting mix of science and spirituality. I do think it's pretty funny. Like, you can look at some of those old books. Like, I have an old astrology book from the early 20th century, and it is really talking about astrology as the new astronomy. It is the new wave of science. So there's so much in trying to prove that this is a viable, valid area of study. And electrobiology is just a fancy way of thinking about energetic readings using electromagnetic waves to notice shifts in the atmosphere. So it's a lot like EMF readers, like we see in ghost hunter shows and scary movies. So I bring up the scientific studies because that becomes a key feature in occult detective stories. And then, of course, we have, at the same time we're developing this love of Gothic literature, this interest in spiritualism, which includes, like, you know, popularizing seances and spirit photography and all of that sort of stuff. We have the development of the classic detective novel. So many people think of Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue as one of the first detective novels, or mystery stories. Although there was a lot of people starting to write like that. So there was a lot of overlap as this genre was developing, and I just love this over-the-top, lurid cover, pulpy cover of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, because it really shows, I think, what people were loving about the mystery genre, which is it's looking at the sordid aspects of life, much like the Gothic, the kind of uncomfortable things that people don't want to look at, but kind of can't look away. So common tropes, we have like the brilliant detective, the sidekick narrator, there's some sort of mystery to solve, and it's really exposing us to what happens behind closed doors. So with that, we have occult detective fiction coming in. So that, I mean, basically, in a nutshell, occult detective fiction combines Gothic with detective fiction. So it's spooky mysteries, essentially. So the only difference between a traditional detective and an occult detective is that the occult detective solves a case that somehow involves ghosts, supernatural, or unexplainable phenomena, or sometimes it disproves that phenomena. A lot of common themes we'll see explored today, both in early and later occult detectives, also work conveniently as content warnings, you'll notice. So particularly in early lit, we have xenophobia, racism, imperialism, issues of mental illness. Across the board, we have issues of like racism, homophobia, white privilege, classism. So a lot of really problematic themes in the early genre that still continue today. And again, good content warnings. On the flip side of that, though, we also have things that the genre is doing, really exploring really powerfully, like the uncanny, the collective unconscious, looking at how certain stories get told across different cultures. You know, we have The Woman in White, we have classic ghost stories, we have all sorts of collective experiences that really shape us. And it's a strange phenomena to think about how these kinds of stories repeat across different times and cultures. And then we have explorations of the supernatural versus the natural. So what if those two things aren't actually all that separate? The sublime and Radcliffean terror, as I mentioned earlier, and this really interesting tension between science and spirit, and science and the supernatural. When we look at the traditional occult detective, much like the original, or much like the development of the mystery novel, we don't have like one clear starting point. We have a bunch of people who kind of started writing spooky mysteries at the same time, particularly because ghost stories became so beloved in the Victorian era. So the traditional occult detective at this time is typically white, male, het cis, affluent, upper class, usually self-educated in the occult, sometimes classically trained in medicine or a paraprofessor, and sometimes even have psychic or supernatural abilities. They're typically curious, but also skeptical. So they're not excluding or ruling out the idea of the paranormal. They just want proof. And according to Tim Pressel, a scholar and writer in the field, there are 4 types of detectives. We have the specialist detective, who just has like a lot of experience dealing with strange goings on. We have the novice detective, which is, I think, probably the most common one, the one we're used to seeing in media, the person who stumbles across a paranormal situation and then slowly gets drawn into the world of the occult. We have the doctor detective, which is usually a medical doctor or sometimes a professor, kind of like a scholar. So we were talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer before we started this presentation, and I think Giles is a really good example of that. And then we have the diviner detective, which I think is probably the second most common detective we see in media, which is the person with supernatural powers being led to solve crimes or mysteries. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the most iconic original occult detectives from the Victorian era and earliest 20th century. And I kind of give you some starting points for some stories to look at and the type of detective they might be, just so we can use it as a framework for talking about the genre later on in the second half of the presentation. I always think these would make like such great playing cards or even tarot cards or trading cards. So if any of you artists want to design occult detective trading cards, that would be awesome. So let's talk Dr. Hesselius, or Dr. Hesselius, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. He was actually designed as a narrator in Sheridan Le Fanu's In a Glass Darkly, which was so he was meant to tie together a bunch of random stories, the most famous of which is Carmilla, the lesbian vampire story. He's first introduced in green tea. He's a doctor detective, so he's really looking at the psychological and the supernatural. Content warnings for this story: it deals with mental illness and suicide. The story opens with Dr. Hesselius trying to help a Reverend Jenkins, I believe is his name, who is really suffering. And it turns out that this Reverend sees this demon monkey following him around. He's literally feeling tortured by this evil monkey spirit. And it comes out that what has happened is that he's had way too much green tea to drink because he's been working really hard on this project. He has too much green tea, which opens up his third eye and makes it so that he can see the spirit realm, which is how we can see this demon monkey following him around. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Hesselius figures that out, but the Reverend is driven crazy by this and ends up killing himself. So Dr. Hesselius is not actually that useful or helpful of an occult detective, he's kind of like an armchair doctor, I would say. He sits back and observes and says, well, that's really interesting, but unfortunately it doesn't really help the poor Reverend. We run into some interesting issues in this story, namely with green tea, which is the scary quote-unquote foreign substance that is basically responsible for the Reverend's condition. So in a lot of these early stories, and you still see this perpetuated in media today, it's always something strange from, the quote-unquote Orient or a foreign place, this foreign substance that we ingest that does bad things to us, which really is tapping into a lot of xenophobic fears. And of course, we have this idea of untreated mental illness and using the supernatural to explain psychological issues. So it's a very interesting story to read. Just, go in knowing that it does not end well, and it definitely makes me happy that we're shifting how we talk about mental illness issues now in our storytelling. The second story is the story of Balebrow, which features Flaxman Low, and he's an occult psychologist, and he's a specialist detective. So he just has like a lot of experience in dealing with spooky stuff. So he's a very interesting character. He gets called into an ancient family home that does have a ghost in it, but everyone knows it has a ghost. It's like a friendly ghost. And the problem is that the ghost has started getting violent. Now, there's issues of sexism and xenophobia and imperialism in this story. So when Flaxman Low goes in, the women's account of what's happening, maids are getting attacked, people are getting killed, everyone's ignoring what the women are saying about it. Flaxman Low steps in a surprisingly progressive move for a story like this and actually listens to the women, and that's how he's able to solve the problem. Now, this is a very bananas plot, so bear with me as I walk you through this. He discovers that because this house is built on an ancient burial ground, there's a ghost there in the ancient burial ground, which is part of the problem. So you can see the B horror movie is writing itself right now. So not only is the house built on an ancient burial ground, but one of the rooms is also like an at-home museum or curio show space where they show off all the beautiful ancient artifacts they've taken from other countries and cultures, and really a bunch of stuff that does not belong to them. So Flaxman Low, because he's a specialist, is able to deduce that the friendly ghost was actually a spirit seed from the ancient burial ground that impregnated or went into the body of a mummy that was in the museum room, and that in turn turned the mummy into a vampire mummy ghost that was preying on the poor family. Now, I sort of think of Flaxman Low as Sam and Dean Winchester before there was Sam and Dean, because he has a very aggressive approach to handling this. He literally shoots up, lights on fire, I think he even like takes a hammer or something to it, a club to it, and then puts it on a boat and lights it on fire to make sure it's gone. So it's this like very masculine, kind of toxically masculine, aggressive approach to getting rid of this evil spirit. Now, interestingly, nobody thinks to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't have built your home on an ancient burial ground. That's disrespectful. Even B movies know that much. They don't stop to say like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have had these artifacts that do not belong to us in our culture. Maybe we should have returned them to their owners, their rightful owners. So it's really lacking a sense of awareness of the white privilege that is happening in the story. But props for imagination. This is, to this day, the only story I've read that features a vampire mummy ghost threat. This next Occult Detective is interesting because it's our first, often considered our first lady occult detective, Diana Marburg, and she's a palmist, so she's one of our diviner detectives. So not only is she our first lady detective, but she's our first detective that has supernatural abilities. And in The Dead Hand, at the turn of the century, she reads the palm of a man who is basically going to commit a murder. She knows he's going to do something bad, but she doesn't, she's sworn to confidentiality and the honor of her trade as a palmist, so she doesn't tell anyone. And then when a murder does happen, she feels morally obligated to solve it. Now, she's interesting because she's able to make her living as a palmist, but she has to be kind of under the shelter of her brother, who is a well-off lawyer. He kind of brings her an air of respectability. She couldn't just do it on her own. And with his kind of support, she's able to stay a respectable lady in society. And yet when she does do her palmistry, she dresses up in what's described as Oriental garb. So there's still this sense of exotifying or orientalizing the supernatural and treating white women in this case as more exotic because they are in touch with the supernatural. So anytime we see this brush with things that seem outside the norm, there's this really intense desire to other it, exoticize it, and make it seem like it's come from a far off place, which is a huge problem. So the story resolves itself with Diana Marburg discovering that the man whose palm she read killed I think it's his nephew, who was going to inherit a lot of money. So now he'll inherit all the money. And he made it look like an accidental drowning, but really he slipped an electric eel into the pond the child was going to swim in, and that's what killed him. Very convoluted plot. And Diana saves the day by uncovering that. And this is probably the first case of an occult detective who has supernatural powers herself, but who is really solving a mundane mystery, which I think is pretty interesting. And then the next one is Tim Pressel's Vera Van Slyke. So this is a very interesting story here. So Tim Pressel, he is a scholar and a writer in the area, and apparently his great-grandaunt Lita wrote a diary or a story about Vera Van Slyke at the turn of the century. And I talked to Tim about this because it's hard to tell if Vera is in fact was a real person or not. And it turns out that Tim does not know. He says it's a 50-50 chance Vera Van Slyke was real. Lita, his great-grandaunt, was known to be a bit of a storyteller, just like Tim, so it's in their blood. So he says 50-50 chance Lita made it up. Either way, Lita positions herself as the narrator for Vera Van Slyke, and it's said that Vera discovers Lita when Lita's working a con as a fake medium. Vera finds her out, and afterwards they team up to both debunk faux hauntings and investigate real paranormal activity. Now, this story is particularly fascinating because it talks about playing certain musical notes. So literally tapping into certain frequencies to trigger violet lights that will appear around haunted spaces. So again, using pseudosciences to record the presence of paranormal activity. I also really love Vera because there's a strong social justice initiative in all these stories. There's one about miners who were killed because of, I think it's like really bad business practices of the people running the mine, and the ghost can't be at peace until she uncovers that. There's another one of soldiers burning diseased blankets because they refused to give them to Native American people, and they got punished for that. And so that story needs to be told in order for the spirits to be set free. And then we find out in one story, King Midas exhumed, that Vera Van Slyke is actually not a white woman, but she's white passing. It turns out she's the descendant of her grandfather and non-consensual relations with an enslaved Black woman. So she's grappling with the terrible reality that she is the product of trauma, that there were people in her family who profited from the exploitation of others. And so you begin to see what drives her work as both a ghost hunter and someone working through the social justice issues tied into those hauntings. And we find this out because in King Midas Exhumed, she's looking at a bar that is haunted and it only spills drinks on Black customers. And so no one understands why it keeps spilling drinks on Vera until the story comes out. And they finally realize that the reason why this haunting is occurring is that this bar was a place on the Underground Railroad, and it was touted as like a really important place, historical marker for that moment in history, for freeing enslaved Black people. Only it turned out the person who owned it used that as a front to actually this is a horrible history. He used it as a front to take enslaved Black people who were fighting for their freedom and selling them back to the South. So until that history was revealed, the ghosts could not rest. And there's some things of the story and all these stories that deal with grappling with our uncomfortable history in America of suppression, exploitation of marginalized identities. But this is a really fun series. Also, just the relationship between Lita and Vera Van Slyke is just delightful. So check it out. The next one is Dr. John Silence, and I love him so much. He is my introduction to this whole genre. I grew up reading him as a child before I knew anything about this. I named my cat Smoke after his cat Smoke. But like with all things in this genre, I have a deep love for what's really wonderful about it, but it's also got its problems. You know, John Silence can also have its xenophobia and racism in his stories. So he is a specialist detective. He's very well off, and he decided to disappear for 5 years and get educated in the occult arts, and he comes back after that with psychic powers. So he's one of the few male detectives here that actually has what would be considered more stereotypically feminine traits, with psychic abilities, very in tune to emotions and energy. And the way he goes about solving things is peering into different dimensions and paying attention to energy. So a psychical invasion, when we're first introduced to him, is all about him helping a writer, and this is funny, dipping into issues of writing angst, but also less funny mental illness issues. This writer is a comedic writer who started writing really dark, twisted stories, and he's coming to John Silence for help because something doesn't feel right. It's revealed that he smoked a lot of weed, and after that is when he started writing weird stories. So again, we have foreign substances entering the body and messing with us. It's really tapping into a lot of fear-mongering surrounding otherness, or things that aren't essentially white or British or American or whatever, or coming from abroad. So John Silence discovers that it is actually a evil ghost. She's called a dark-skinned ghost that is haunting this poor writer, and he figures out how to banish it. And of course, anytime something is listed as dark-skinned, you know, that is racializing evil or the monster. So we want to be aware of how those things play out in our stories. So on the one hand, I think John Silence does a really great job about talking about energy and spiritual dimensions. You know, that's the bruja side of my work. On the other, you know, we have to acknowledge that when we talk about fearing the paranormal, it's also so often a catchphrase for anything that is different from white, het cis, male, able-bodied, neurotypical experiences. For example, where this story really shines, though, is how he talks about alternate dimensions. He brings his pets, his dog Ash and his cat Smoke, in to help him on his investigations because he knows that animals see more than meets the human eye. So it's a really interesting look at how the spirit realm affects us day in, day out, and it's always with us, but we aren't always aware of it, right? Animals have a much stronger lens to see these things. And then our last one for this part of the discussion is Thomas Carnacki, Ghost Finder, and he is just a treat. He is a specialist detective, and he uses the scientific method. So he most notably started he has his toolkit. So he uses spirit photography, so trying to catch ghosts on camera. He puts beeswax across window seals to see if they've been tampered with. He puts ribbons across doors to see if spirits have moved them. And he is most famous for inventing the electric pentacle, which I think is just a lovely combination of spirituality and science. And this pentacle is used to not only monitor spiritual activity, but protect from evil. So this is one of the earliest sightings I know, were explorations of amulets and symbols protecting people from evil that aren't religious crosses or holy water or anything like that. So it's very cool. In The Gateway of the Monster, he goes to help an old family estate again that is haunted. Interestingly, the thing that's haunting it is not something that's been brought in from a far, far away place, but it's actually one of the ancestors of the old family. And that ancestor was a terrible person and always wore a certain ring. I think it was like a family ring or a crest on the ring. And anyway, Thomas Carnacki realizes, hey, I think it's the ring that is keeping this monster here, and if I can destroy the ring and trap the monster inside it, then the problem is solved. So it's one of the first instances, too, we see where a specific object is tied to a haunting, which energetically I think is always so fascinating. Like, our energy affects the objects we have. Objects absorb energies. Again, you see this sort of B-movie of someone buying an object or a dress or something and literally becomes haunted by it because that object has absorbed the evil of the predecessor, right? One content warning here too, Thomas Carnacki does also use animals like John Silence, only the animals do not fare well in those stories. John Silence loves his animals and takes good care of them. Thomas Carnacki is a little bit more into scientific experiments with them, is all I'll say. Lastly, Carnacki investigates stories that sometimes involve a supernatural answer and sometimes don't. So sometimes people call him in because they think there's a ghost, and it turns out there's a very mundane answer for what's going on. So lots of fun. So one thing I will say about this is all of these stories, I think especially Carnacki, Marburg, and John Silence, I think they would make really great TV series. Either, set in the Victorian era or modernized for today. The way the stories are told, the way they're set up as short stories, I think really work well in that formula. Of course, we would have to update them so that we're not carrying the bad stuff, the xenophobia and the racism and all of that with it. If you want to know more about traditional supernatural Sherlocks, I would recommend this book, which really has a great selection of stories, many of which I mentioned here, that just really kind of set up the groundwork for the traditional occult detective. And the editor does a good job of contextualizing them about stories that are really racist and xenophobic and dated, but are worth noting so we understand that history, and some that stand up a little bit better. I also recommend Tim Pressel's website, Brown Bones Books, because he has some great stuff like a Ghost Hunter Hall of Fame, a bibliography of early ghost hunters, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff that is there. So we are going to take a quick pause here for some Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing here. Okay, so we're moving forward to urban fantasy, and I spent a lot of the early half of this lecture looking at early 20th century and late 19th century occult detectives. And we're going to jump forward a little bit into the late 20th century. But first, I just want to say that it's not like there was a huge gap in occult detective studies throughout that time, even though I'm jumping up like 60 years or so. People were still pretty fascinated with it. And then when the Gothic romance came into popularity mid-century, that kind of got things rolling again. Agatha Christie wrote some interesting supernatural mysteries, a lot of them which ended up being pretty racist and xenophobic, but she even dipped her pinky toe into that genre. So it was always kind of going. The big reincarnation that we see, or a revitalization we see, is when urban fantasy takes the fort in the 70s. So it's real world setting with fantasy elements, and we still have all the same content warnings and themes, but now we have some new ones. We have this idea of coexisting. So a lot of the 90s cult detective shows start looking at monsters not as monsters, but as just a different type of human being, and really exploring the idea that difference doesn't equal evil. Although it's kind of a problem for me because a lot of them still feature predominantly white casts. So when they're saying white vampires, white werewolves, and white people can coexist, it kind of erases that message of diversity and inclusivity. But I get what it's trying to do. We also have feminism, which I've kept separate from ideas of social justice and inclusivity, because as we'll see when we move into urban fantasy, the genre in the 90s and early 2000s becomes very intensely feminist. It really centers strong female figures, but it's really famed in white feminism. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we talk about intersexual identities. So not just a wizard, but a queer wizard, not just like in the Charmed reboot, I'm not just a witch, but I'm a bruja, and I'm also queer, or I'm Afro-Latinx bruja. So playing with what those things look like, that we aren't just one thing. And of course, social justice. So drawing on the legacy of Vera Van Slyke, recognizing that we can't separate the personal from the political, the spiritual from social justice, all that good stuff. And then some fun stuff like we were talking about earlier. You get a lot of leather-clad heroines, which I think is super bananas, and it's got its problems, but it's pretty fun and funny if you understand the pulpiness behind it. And the big thing we get moving forward is this idea of meta-awareness. So the genre's awareness of itself as a genre with a strong fan base. And then we get a lot of reoccurring tropes. Like if you read enough of these stories, there's always going to be the monster fight club story. You will always get something eventually with vampires, werewolves, fairies, or witches. You'll always get a story where the real monster ends up being a human being. So it's really fun to see how these stories kind of keep reinventing themselves, but also exploring similar ground. And then, of course, fanfic is a huge deal. And a lot of the modern urban fantasy today is really coming out of like Buffy fanfic and that sort of stuff. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. But first, I would like to talk about Kolchak, the Night Stalker, which is it's a short-lived TV series, but it was also, I think, set up as a movie or two as well. So 2 movies and then a short-lived season of a series in the 70s. And this was the show that really kind of put monster hunter stories or occult detectives on TV. And you see it has a lot of the traditional pulpy iconography of the cross, keeping evil away. He wears a straw hat, which shows like what an everyman he is. And Kolchak is a total hoot. He is not a cop. He is a freelance journalist, and he's always looking for the next big scoop. So this is a huge departure from traditional occult detectives because he's not this like privileged white male. He's a working class man. He is engaging with various underbellies of, I believe it's Chicago. So we're not, in these nice, pristine estates or nice spaces where, outside evil enters in. It's in and all around us, and it's looking at different communities. Now he has a supernatural Jack the Ripper. He has a evil lizard. He has a zombies. He does like a hoodoo. There's like a hoodoo or voodoo episode, which you will always see that pretty regularly in the genre, although it never gets those conjure practices right. But they always kind of play with the idea of like voodoo dolls and things like that. Kolchak is especially interesting because he would be considered like the novice detective where he stumbles into the supernatural. And part of the fun of the show is that he's always looking for evidence to prove this story so that he can write it, because it would make such a great story for his paper. And the series always ends with, photos being destroyed, evidence being destroyed. And he's always saying, this would make a great story, but no one would believe me. So it's this idea of the supernatural being in and around us all the time, not something coming from abroad or far away, but always with us. And some of us can see it and some of us can't. Now, not a lot of people know about Kolchak. It's most memorable because it directly inspired and influenced how the X-Files was made, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then, of course, we have the iconic Ghostbusters. So for now, I'm just talking about the original film, not any of the sequels or spin-offs. This is so iconic. I grew up watching this movie. I grew up loving this movie. I think when people think of monster hunters or ghost hunter fiction, you can say Ghostbusters and people know what you're talking about, even if they've never seen the movie. So Ghostbusters really put the genre on the map in terms of mainstream culture. And one of the things it did is it made it took away, I think, some of the terror of, the Radcliffian terror of the genre, this fear of the unknown, this desire to control and manage it, and really made it kind of fun and hilarious. So we have silly ghosts like Slimer. The big evil at the end of the first movie is the giant marshmallow man. Not all that scary, right? So it makes ghosts funny, makes we are introduced to the one-liners that become really iconic to the genre of monster hunters. And of course, they have their standard outfits. I would say they're the specialist detectives or even doctor detectives, because they're all, well-studied pseudoscientists in their field of electromagnetic blah, blah, blah. So they use EMF readers. They have their special scientific goo. So they're really grounding the idea of the supernatural in a sort of pseudoscience, which is very fun and kind of reassuring, right? It's not as scary as maybe building your home on an ancient burial ground. And yet, as much as I love this, not all of it ages well. Vinkman here in particular, he's kind of the romantic lead. It opens with him doing some questionable stuff to get in the pants of the young women the young female students who he is supposed to be helping out, student volunteers for his science project. He's a professor, and it's really played for laughs in the 80s, and I think it's in alignment with a lot of mainstream 80s humor, but it doesn't age well, especially in the wake of Me Too. And now that I'm a professor, I watch that and I just cringe because it's everything super awful that you're like, no, thank you. And yet a lot of times people don't think of Ghostbusters as a very political film, but it has a really interesting, like, centrist political message about, like, the the individualist capitalists pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. They're kicked out of academia. They have to make it on their own, and they're the men who get stuff done with their small business know-how. And the evil villains are like the biohazard bureaucracies that are getting in the way of them, containing their ghosts, and all these different things that just won't let them do their job. So you can tell it has a pretty interesting political agenda, selling this kind of like centrist American dream of, financial and economic agency and all that good stuff. But I think a lot of that gets buried because people are thinking about it as just a fun Ghostbuster movie. But important to look at the politics behind it. And then we have Hellblazer, one of my favorites. John Constantine starts in 1985, and he has, first, he's like a huge inspiration in a lot of future occult detectives. So Castiel in Supernatural is heavily based off of him, down to the trench coat, the beige trench coat, white shirt, and black tie. So it's hard not to see those echoes of Constantine in Castiel. And Constantine really busts the genre right open. He was framed as a blue-collar wizard. So he taught himself the occult arts. He looks for synchronous signs when magic is afoot. He's kind of a terrible person, but has his own moral code. He's a trickster anti-hero. So his friends that are close to him don't always fare well, but he does have this sense of keeping the world order in check. He's also canonically, I always want to say bi, but actually I read more data to say that he's canonically pansexual. So as the series develops, you see him in relationships with people of all genders. There's one that focuses specifically on him and his sexual preferences. He goes into, I think, like a BDSM club, and so he's kink positive. So those are really important things that I think kind of bust open a lot of the heteronormativity and the strict sexual mores that we might associate with some of the traditional occult detectives. And of course, if you've ever read any of the Hellblazer series, everything is so incredibly political and social justice oriented. And, they still have their xenophobia and racism and homophobia and all of that, but I think Constantine is really making a concerted effort to center the stories of people with marginalized identities. They're no longer the things on those stories are no longer on the social periphery. They're front and center and really humanized. So one of my favorites that I like to teach is in Original Sins, Going For It, which features demon yuppies, and it's about gentrification with the backdrop of Margaret Thatcher era. And it's a really fun look because the evil is not those with marginalized identities. The evil is literally demon brokers who are chasing people out of their neighborhoods and doing bad things. So he really ups the stakes of what we're allowed to talk about in the genre and how we can complicate the idea of what is monstrous, truly monstrous. Forever Night, this is a new one I got into after listening to Introspectional podcast. And this is our first vampire detective TV show. So a lot of people credit Angel with that. It's actually Forever Night. And if you see the tagline here, it's pretty wonderful. 13th century vampire, 20th century cop. And the story, the TV show features him in his flashbacks and then as a modern cop trying to redeem his life of vice as a vampire. It has some progressive episodes. Since he is such a worldly vampire, he seems more progressive in a lot of ways compared to his partners. So various cases take them to people with different cultural backgrounds. There's a episode about AIDS, which is pretty progressive for the 90s. I think a lot of it feels a little dated for sure, but for a 90s show, it's interesting some of the stuff they did. Forever Night is also part of what spawned fan fiction in the genre. So we have this show that everyone loved. It ended after 3 seasons, and everyone hated the series finale in which he basically accidentally kills the woman who's trying to help him become human. So he wants to do good by people and also become human again. So he accidentally kills her. And it turns out he loves her, so he accidentally kills her, and then he has someone, his vampire sire, kill him because he says, it's time to leave and we can be together in heaven. Everyone was super upset because it's a downer ending to what is an otherwise more lighthearted show. So basically, people scrapped the ending and started writing their own fanfic solution to it. So this is one of the series that really looms large in people's imaginations, particularly because it feels so unfinished to them. Then we have, I'm going to jump into urban fantasy as like a book genre. We have the Diane Tre Guard series by Mercedes Lackey, and it features a young, I believe she's like a witch or a psychic. She manages an occult shop, writes romance novels to pay the bills, and then starts solving supernatural crimes. And you can see here on the covers, it really has a lot of the skinny white lady all in black, looking edgy and fierce and magical and a little bit sexy, with the kind of the dark colors, the dark purples and grays of the genre. Some of it is really interesting, like Children of the Night features psychic vampires, so they aren't feeding off your blood, they're feeding off your energy. And then there's some that, Burning Water, I don't think I made it all the way through that. There's some xenophobia issues and things like that coming through, but it's really starting to set the standard of the new urban fantasy occult detective heroine. And that really gets solidified with the Tanya Huff Blood books, starting with Blood Ties. And I use this cover because Lifetime turned it into a short-lived 2-season series that's pretty campy and bananas. And it has all the like racism and xenophobia and all of that in there. Worth looking at though, because it's very 2000s. The series itself, I think, is interesting because it's one of the few examples we have in the genre of a protagonist with disabilities. So Vicki Nelson is a tough girl cop who comes down with a disease that essentially means she's losing her eyesight. So she's slowly going blind. So rather than sit behind a desk as a cop, she becomes a private investigator. And as she's losing her sight, she's being exposed to the world of the paranormal. So she's like a novice detective where she's learning as she goes. And her vampire friend is protecting her and helping her solve mysteries. I don't think they handle disability quite as well as they could, especially how it's resolved in the end. I won't give any spoilers, but it's worth checking out. She's also pretty much the iconic urban fantasy heroine wearing leather. Her strength is framed in terms of white feminism. She's strong just like a man, and that's a pretty outdated way of looking at strength. She punches like a man, she drinks like a man, she's tough like a man, she has trouble articulating her emotions like a man. So there's a lot of real sexist, limited thinking about gender, for one, both in masculinity and femininity, and what makes a person strong. I do like to give a brief shout out to the spin-off Smoke and Shadows, featuring Tony Foster, who was Vicki Nelson's, one of her informants on the streets. He gets cleaned up, moves, he did drugs, he did all sorts of stuff to get by, and he is able to get out of that life and become an assistant on the set of a TV show, and the TV show is a vampire detective show. So there's that moment again where you see the meta aspects. This is an occult detective show. This is an occult detective book that's about someone working on an occult detective TV series, right? Slowly, as he's working on this, he hooks up with this vampire guy, Henry Fitzroy. They have a bit of an on-again, off-again romantic relationship, so it's a queer story. And eventually, Tony starts realizing that he's also a wizard, and he is protecting the world from all sorts of forces. So I love this because it centers a queer character, but it's not about a big coming out narrative or his oppression. He's just Tony Foster, wizard, queer person, film person, like all these different things. So it's not his sole identity trait, which I think is important because we'll talk momentarily about when queering characters doesn't quite go right. Then we have the Anita Blake vampire series. I'm not going to talk about this one too much because I want to leave a little room at the end to talk about some series that are a little more have more complicated histories. But basically, this is when we think of Ghostbuster or Monster Hunter series, we think of sexy vampires, right? And part of that is because of the Anita Blake series, where it really upped the stakes in terms of making the occult sexy and blurring the lines between killing monsters and wanting to get busy with them. So it gets a little bit, instead of being always afraid of the other or the supernatural, now we're kind of turned on by it, right? We want to see what that's all about. And of course, back to TV, we have the X-Files, and it takes the idea of the paranormal in a very interesting new direction. Instead of supernatural monsters, we're dealing with aliens from outer space and government conspiracy theories and all of that. And this is probably the first time, maybe outside of Forever Night, where we're seeing so it's one of the first times where we're seeing an occult detective team that people would like to see coupled up. So we're starting to see those ships happen. And again, without Kolchak, we wouldn't have the X-Files. So they really took the kind of conspiracy theory framework of Kolchak and applied it to X-Files, that there are a handful of people who really know what's going on in the world, but it's hard to prove it. And then, of course, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I was in love with the 1992 movie when it came out, and it took me longer to get into the series. But the series is where we really see this explosion of the urban fantasy genre, and particularly the young, skinny, white female protagonist. So this is what I mean by like white feminism. It centers female narratives, but a specific look, right? Young, skinny, white. And oftentimes she's very empowered, but the characters with marginalized identities are less empowered. So she's either saving them, or they're either victims or villains. So One of the things I love about Buffy, though, is it takes a classic Gothic character, the damsel in distress, the young, vulnerable woman, and flips the script on it and makes her an incredibly powerful agent of fighting evil, right? There's an ongoing joke in the series that she's the monster the other monsters are afraid of. So she's not frail. She has power, and she is yet also very much a teenage girl who is worried about high school crushes and fashion and going to prom and all of that. Now, at the time, of course, that is a very radical concept. Now it feels super dated, and you see some people in the genre that are stuck in that version of female empowerment. So I respect what Buffy did for its time, but I do think we need to develop beyond that. And of course, it's hard to really talk about Buffy without acknowledging all the terrible stuff that's coming out about Joss Whedon. So I think it's, we can acknowledge what an important, iconic series that was, while also realizing that we can do more with it, and certainly expect more from people who are creating this content. The other thing I'll say about Buffy is, for a mainstream show in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a pretty big deal that they queered one of their primary characters halfway through the show's run. So Willow, her best friend, becomes a witch and realizes that she's gay. There's some bi erasure here where, by today's standards, we'd say Willow is bi because she was in a long-term loving relationship with Oz, a man, before she started having feelings for Tara. But, that was not something that was, considered a lot. Like, bi erasure is so common. But, so Willow is queered, and there's a really interesting story of empowerment as she comes into her power as a witch and a bisexual character. Again, not all of it's perfect. They don't really do a lot of good stuff with like people of color. They do have a bury the gays trope, all of that sort of stuff. I do want to just briefly mention the Angel spinoff. Again, a lot of people think this is like the first vampire detective show, but of course the credit goes to Forever Night. And actually, the creators of Angel really looked at Forever Night when figuring out how to tell a vampire detective show. So they use that as a framework. Okay, and now we have the Dresden Files, and we're almost done here. So the Dresden Files in the 2000s features Harry Dresden, a wizard PI in Chicago, and he keeps getting embroiled in the politics of the magical world. So we have vampires, werewolves, fairies, all sorts of magical creatures, with the idea that the magical world is all around us. Not everyone can access it, though, but it still affects the mundane world. And this is where we really, really dive into the meta aspects of the genre. So there's a vampire character named Thomas in this series that wears a Buffy the Vampire Slayer t-shirt. So part of the love of this story is Jim Butcher's own love of the genre, from Anita Blake to Buffy, etc. And there's other books, like Benedict Jacka has a series, the Alex Vera, that references Harry Dresden. So it becomes a very fun niche genre where there's all these really cool Easter eggs for people who love reading and watching this stuff and know how to look for it. So we have, and then of course we have crossovers, like the audiobooks are read by James Marsters, who was Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So we have all this really fun history. And part of the reason why we can have that interconnected metafictional dialogue is, of course, because of the internet. So many people are able to connect over these things in a way that you wouldn't have been able to in the time of Kolchak. And then I'm skipping way ahead, and I'm skipping over shows like Charmed and all of that to talk about Supernatural, which ran for 15 years. And I want to spend a little more time on this one because the first time I talked about it in the previous lecture, it got a little short shrift. And this is important to talk about because it's a very complicated show with a strange history within the canon of the Occult Detective. So it's ran for 15 years, and it is a very different show at the end than from what it started as. So it starts in 2005 as a very iconically early 2000s show, very strict gender norms, really sexist, macho guys with their girls of the week. So Buffy established the idea of the monster of the week. And interestingly, the whole framework of Buffy, I forgot to mention, is high school is a horror show, which I think is very relatable. So we have our monster of the week that deals also with psychological elements. So the girl who's feeling invisible literally becomes invisible. Every time Buffy's going through something, there's a monster that week to mirror what she's going through. And without Buffy, there would be no Supernatural. So I have a lot of students who get into the genre because of Supernatural without realizing that Buffy is really what enables shows like Supernatural to run. Now, Supernatural follows the same Monster of the Week formula, but it also has like the girl of the week, or treating women as not quite humanized. So it starts out as a very sexist show, very homophobic, and then it changes over the course of 15 years to embrace its queer fandom. So there's a lot of love for Sam and Dean. Even though they're brothers, they have what's called Wincest fan fiction. Dean and Castiel, Destiel, there's a huge romance stuff going on there. And so a lot of people say that the only reason the show lasted as long as it did is because it really leaned into the metafictional aspect of the show. It had guests from other occult detective shows. It leaned into the queer fandom and then queered the canon at the end. Now, when I teach this to my students, I always tell them that this show is one of the most deeply homophobic and homoerotic shows that has been on the air. So I think it stands out because when it starts in 2015, it's very much meant to be a scary show and kind of entrenched in a lot of old gender norms. Where it ends up is a little more playful and campy and speaking to the audience that wanted to follow them for 15 years. Now, let's talk about some of the contentious stuff. So at the end, the whole story ends, it just wrapped up recently, with Castiel confessing his love to Dean. And there's a lot of joy that they officially queered the canon, but that got pretty quickly squashed because then Castiel immediately dies. Dean never clearly says, "I love you" back. And I think most people agree that the series finale was garbage. Some people defended it in the sense that, okay, Castiel went to super hell, but then he was also put into heaven and made God, and it's assumed that Dean is there too, so they get to live out their love story in paradise. So you see the fan fiction already spinning off. I think this is going to go the way of Forever Night, where people are just going to scrap the ending of this and just keep writing their fanfic. I think this is a show that isn't one that can necessarily be made today. If you flip it on to one of the first few episodes, you see how dated it is. In many ways, Buffy does not feel as dated as Supernatural. And I think what this show is showing is, as the kinds of stories are changing within the genre, this show is kind of having to keep up with that audience and what they could be telling. And yet it's within this really difficult framework of toxic masculinity. So you see them try to develop that, where you see the brothers grow and have their, bro movements or emotional moments where they talk things out and have feelings. And you really see them try to work through those issues of toxic masculinity. However, a lot of fans felt like their discussions of queer fandom, or their reaching out to queer fandom, resulted in queer baiting, which I completely agree with. I think it's totally valid. And I think this show stuck between being what it was originally and trying to figure out how to be a more queer friendly show without actually having the literacy for it is how I think of it. And of course, bury the gays tropes galore, which is, again, a huge problem. I look at this as a show that's kind of stuck between old ways of telling stories and trying to figure out new ways, but not quite hitting the mark. And you see some shows stuck in that now, like Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, trying to be progressive, but not quite meeting the mark in some ways. At the same time, I think if it weren't for this queering of or embracing the queer fandom, it would have been harder to get shows like Winona Earp going, which feature explicit, joyful, queer love stories. So this is definitely, and it's interesting to me to, so I've seen some of the early episodes of Supernatural and popped into some of the later ones, but I haven't seen the whole series. But I have students who are deeply, deeply in love with this show, some of them queer students, and some of them who got into writing by writing queer fan fiction, or finding a sense of community as they were exploring their sexuality. So on the one hand, this is a deeply problematic text and very upsetting. On the other hand, you know, I want to respect what this show meant for like some of my students who really found a sense of belonging through these characters. And interestingly, I think more in the fanfic sides than the actual show itself. So I think at a certain point, the fandom became more important than the show. But yeah, so much to discuss when we get to the Q&A portion, but I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. And as we move forward, I want to show you some shows that I think are trying to do just that, like saying we can't just stick to old modes of occult detective storytelling where anything supernatural is a placeholder for xenophobic, homophobic, racist, ableist beliefs. So one show that I think does this particularly well is Sleepy Hollow, and just the first season. So if you watch it, just watch the first season and ignore everything else. And the reason why is because we have Abby Mills, who is this like strong, confident, capable Black woman, and yet she's not the traditional urban fantasy heroine in the sense that she's trying to be macho like a stereotypical man. She's incredibly empathetic. She's incredibly vulnerable and strong. She's all these things. She feels like a real human being. And Sleepy Hollow also features a primarily Black cast, with Ichabod Crane being the literal odd person out. He's outside of time. He gets resurrected to modern day life, and he's literally like one of the token white boys of the show. So it's really fun to see how this show takes something like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and pairs these two together to fight the coming apocalypse, with the 7 horsemen of the apocalypse starting to take over. And they use that supernatural framework to talk about very uncomfortable things within American history, but they do it in a very generous and forgiving way that doesn't center trauma. So Abby gets to be more than this history of Black trauma, essentially. She is her own empowered identity. So again, please only watch the first season, because the rest is a dumpster fire that undoes all the work of the first season. And then iZombie, I really like to talk about this one because it's a really interesting metaphor for assault. So, you know, some trigger warnings for that if you're gonna watch it. Liv Moore is this, you know, go-getter medical student, and she goes to a party and essentially, in what is a metaphor for assault, gets attacked and finds out she's a zombie. And so the whole first episode is about her grappling with what happened to her and how her life has radically changed. And while a traditional Monster of the Week TV show would spend a whole season with her grappling in that angst, in that trauma, and being afraid to talk to anybody about what happened to her, the first episode is very much about her realizing that she's not alone and that she has allies. So Ravi Chakrabarti, who is my favorite character in the whole show, he is her boss. She ends up working for a morgue because she needs brains to live, and it's an easy, safe way for her to get food. He pretty much discovers pretty quickly that she's a zombie, and he doesn't villainize her for it, which I think is an important thing. When somebody goes through trauma, they can be made to feel monstrous for something outside of their control. And Ravi never does that, right? He says, this happened to you. I can help you. You have nothing to be ashamed about, and I can actually maybe find the cure. So by the end of the pilot episode, she has an ally and she has hope, which changes the whole trajectory of the story that gets told. She is not just this zombie or this victim. She now has hope and the possibility of a new future, and a future that looks different from maybe what she was planning, but she still has plenty of undead life ahead of her. So she's a lot like Diane Marburg, where she uses supernatural talents to solve mundane crimes. This series does a good job of looking at intersectional identities. So, it's a good start, I should say, where we have, zombies, people of color, queer people, queer zombies, zombies of color. So you're starting to see complex intersectional identities that are not as clean cut as white monster versus white human. And Robbie's, again, like I said, one of my favorite characters. And I love the way, even though I think there should be more people of color in the story, they don't always handle the side characters who are people of color. They don't always handle that stuff well. I think Robbie's a really interesting character because he's a successful person of color. He completely knows that there was a zombie outbreak going to happen. He's instrumental in solving these things. So seeing like a successful, well-balanced person of color who's smart and has an active love life and all these things, I think is really important to see on TV, because we honestly get so little of that. It does fall a little bit short in some areas, like there's a whole Underground Railroad storyline later in the series that I don't think holds up well, especially when, we're looking at a genre that talks about monsters in terms of coexisting, but it continues to erase people of color. I think it's weird when you co-opt something like the Underground Railroad for those stories, so it didn't quite hold up there, but definitely worth looking at. And then, of course, we have Lucifer, which is, again, a supernatural person solving mundane crimes. And I forget how quietly radical this show can be until I have students watch it who are a little more religious, and they talk about how uncomfortable it is to see the devil centered as a likable protagonist. I also think people kind of get lost in his hetero romance with Chloe and forget that he's actually bi in the show. And I would say realistically, he's probably pansexual. This is also a spinoff from a graphic novel by Mike Carey, which is very, very dark and very, very different. So just as a heads up. But this show is light, it's playful. In the pilot episode, you see him get out of bed and there's a man and a woman in there. So he's bisexual, polyamorous, realistically I think pansexual. There's all these playful jokes throughout the series where you see him joyfully engaging with like BDSM and geek culture. And it's just this really joyful explosion of sexuality. Some people were really offended to see those things framed as like the devil's domain, which I understand for sure, especially because Maze is one of the few women of color on the show, and she's a demon, also pansexual, also into kink culture, and it's weird when she's a demon who's into that, right? Or it's demonized. I tend to read Lucifer in terms of him as Lucifer Morningstar, the light bringer. So he's an enlightened being. So, you know, rigid sexual identities or sexual purity norms are for the birds, and he wants to bring us enlightenment by saying consensual, joyful fun is a beautiful thing. But again, I would like to see that popped up a little bit more. I think that's the best part of the show, and it gets lost with his like hetero romance with Chloe. I also think let's see. Oh, and I think the other thing the story does really well is it makes a clear distinction between what I think more conservative people might think of as evil, like kink culture, versus actual evil, people committing murders or doing or hurting others. So Lucifer does a really beautiful job of exploring desire that is beautiful and valid, and seeking justice on people who are doing bad things. And then lastly, I would just want to cover a couple shows again that I think are pushing the genre in some interesting directions. Wynonna Earp gets a lot of attention for, it's a sort of fantasy horror Western about a descendant of Wild Earp who basically is in charge of keeping zombies in check in Wyoming. It's most famous, though, for its love story between Waverly and Officer Hot, also known as #WayHot. And one of the reasons why people love it so much is it's a low angst romance. It's not about a huge coming out narrative. It's just two people who love each other fighting the forces of evil together. So it's joyful, it's normalized. They recently, in their final season, had a big sex scene that was like a really big deal, and people were so excited to see that. Some people did critique it in the sense that we need to move beyond skinny white lesbian love and look at queer love through different lenses, which I agree with. But it's interesting to see, us going from the supernatural legacy, really struggling with how to incorporate queer ideology, and Wynonna Earp just joyfully having queer characters already and not needing to, queer bait and all of that. One show, though, that I think doesn't get enough attention is Lost Girl in 2010, and I think it does sexual positivity in such a powerful way, and I think more people should take a look at it. It doesn't handle race very well, but sex positivity is fantastic. It centers Bo, who realizes she is a succubus, and in this world, succubus is part of the fairy kingdom, so she's fae, and they all have magical powers, and the divide is between the fae keeping their identities separate from human world. So the only taboo is fae and humans getting together, which Bo quickly squashes because she's all about breaking those boundaries. But what I love about this show is there's a lot of freedom in sexual identity here. They don't use any terms like gay or bi or polyamorous or even queer. It's just people loving people, fae loving people, everyone getting in the mix. And so Bo is pansexual and polyamorous, and it shows a really good depiction of like what an open polyamorous relationship would look like, like in a healthy way. I also love that she's never slut shamed for being a succubus. And in the traditional urban fantasy occult detective genre, the woman has to be tough as nails and struggles with dating and sex and all these things. Bo gets to have her cake and eat it too. She's sexually active. She has a lot of romantic interests, and she also kicks ass, and not once is her sexuality or her romantic life or her emotional life seen as something that diminishes her work as a private investigator. In fact, it's seen as something that really enhances who she is and the work she does. And then lastly, I want to give a shout out to Trail of Lightning, particularly because it's set in New Mexico, which is where I'm from. So this is part of a new series of, I think, speculative fiction, horror, urban fantasy that's coming out that's really centering occult detectives with marginalized identities. So here we have Maggie Hosky, who is essentially a Navajo monster hunter in a post-apocalyptic world where the gods roam free. So it's really beautifully done. Even though it's in a post-apocalyptic world, I feel like she nails a lot of New Mexican culture, and I love that she centers indigenous stories that aren't just about trauma and oppression, but survival and agency and empowerment. Now, she did get some. There has been some controversy about her because she is not actually a Navajo person. She is half Black and from Okepewinge. But she's lived on the Navajo reservations for a long time. She's married a Navajo man, and according to some, culturally, through Navajo culture, that means she is now part of the Navajo community. So a lot of people see that her being able to write about this, she wouldn't have been able to write about it if her Navajo family had not given her permission to do so, which I agree with. I also, unfortunately, think there's a lot of lateral oppression and, frankly, anti-Blackness in the Indigenous communities. So I think part of the hate coming our way is because she is half Black, unfortunately. It's terrible to have to say that lateral oppression is there, but there are plenty of white authors who appropriate Indigenous narratives and do not get the kind of hate that's coming at Rebecca Roanhorse and the really, really thoughtful, well-researched, well-done book here, and just really powerful storytelling. And then lastly, as I'm kind of wrapping this up, I just want to give you a sense of like all the different sorts of TV shows we have. Of course, we have Scooby-Doo, which I didn't talk about. And that's a show, actually, this is a great answer to the question that was asked earlier about regular detectives who brush up against the supernatural. Most of Scooby-Doo seems like it's dealing with a supernatural occurrence, but it really ends up being, old man so-and-so in a sheet. But there are a couple of episodes where it ends up being actually a paranormal situation. We have some sci-fi options like Torchwood, Warehouse 13, Stranger Things, Haven, which I think does a really good job of looking at psychological trauma and generational trauma. Charmed, of course, there's a whole line of witchy occult detectives. Pushing Daisies, Truth Seekers just came out, Total Hoot. And then we have a whole bunch in the urban fantasy genre, everything from the iconic, sexy leather pants, crop top, holding a weapon, looking, deadly sexy, occult detective heroines, to very dark horror by Mike Carey, to fun, lighthearted paranormal romances, paranormal cozies like What's a Ghoul to Do. And these two are really fun, by Juliet Blackwell. Haunted Home Renovation Series, a woman who renovates homes for a living and always finds hauntings there. Another witchy one that I like to teach a lot, Secondhand Spirits. She's a witch who owns a secondhand store, so like a vintage clothing store, and gets into all sorts of mayhem. And then we have really cool ones like Daniel Jose Older, Half Resurrection Blues, looking at intersectional identities. The Latinx communities in New York, in Brooklyn. The character on this cover is Latinx and also undead. And so I think he does a really good job of exploring how we as human beings have different identities, intersectional identities, and really muddies the water in terms of what is evil. You have monsters and ghosts who are good people, and then you see some people who are very, very monstrous. And then lastly, I want to end with a plug for Occult Detective magazine, which used to be Occult Detective Quarterly. John Lintwent Grant started it. And one of the things I love about this is it's you're getting some interesting fanfic of like Karnacki-inspired stories, for example. But then you're also getting stories that are really trying to push the boundaries of what the genre is. So I love this magazine because from day one, they really pushed wanting more diverse stories, stories that center BIPOC characters, LGBTQ characters, authors with different backgrounds, people with neurodivergence and differing abilities. So they're coming from a deep love of the genre, but also recognizing that we need to expand and move beyond some of the toxic aspects of it. So that is all I have for you today. I am going to stop the screen now and leave it open for questions. Thank you so much